Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this CBR webinar on behalf of our host, Sugar CRM. My name is Ambrose McNevin. I'm the Editor-in-Chief at Computer Business Review. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, where we will be discussing a new reality for banking and developing a customer journey. Today's event will last for just about an hour. So what's going to happen over the next 45 minutes is we're going to get an in-depth presentation from a true industry expert who is Phil Winters, Customer Perspective Champion and, quote, Data Whisperer. We can ask maybe in the Q&A session for a definition of what that is. So I'm also, as your host, going to be interjecting occasionally with some polling questions, and after the presentation we're going to have an in-depth Q&A which is going to run for about 15 minutes or so. So please do ask any questions throughout the presentation, and we want to make this session as interactive as possible. So I'm going to welcome you to the webinar platform, which is On24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link you receive via the email and you will rejoin the session. You'll see certain widgets and buttons on your screen. So in order to ask questions, you can submit those by just clicking on the Q&A tab and then typing those into the box. And as I say, we will allocate time for a Q&A session at the end of the main presentation. But remember, you'll also be invited to take part in the poll questions throughout the session, and we'd really appreciate your input there as it gives us a perspective on what's happening out there in the market. So, as I say, the format is the main presentation, polling questions which we'd like you to engage with, and then submit your questions for Q&A at the end. But just before I hand over to Phil and to Sugar CRM, just a little bit of perspective on what I see as from going on in the banking industry. Clearly, retail banking, customer expectation, customer journey is a very, very hot topic at the moment. Competition has never been higher, expectations have never been greater, and also it's very fast moving from a technology perspective. On the competition front, over the top players are nibbling away at different banking products. Banks themselves, the traditional retail banks, are struggling to get a single customer view. They're investing heavily in order to try to offer appropriate products to the right customers at the right time, and we see an awful lot of efforts being put in various different perspectives or from different technological angles in order to, as I say, get that view of what the customer needs, and also then to match, as we say, those expectations. You have the over-the-top players such as PayPal coming in to take payments. We have other challenger banks that are emerging, especially in the UK, like Atom and others coming onto both on the high street and onto platforms. And one thing that came out yesterday was a survey from the UK Card Association, which said that this year in June, 18% of all transactions are now contactless. All card transactions are now contactless, which is I offer this as just as a single perspective data point to say people thought that customers were not going to use contactless cards because they wouldn't trust them. These things are surging ahead. This is growing at 33% year over year in terms of the amount that is being transacted or payments that are being made through contactless. So just in 1 month, this is 1.8 billion in the month of June going through these. The next step is obviously that you would say that people are not going to do mobile payments. I know mobile payments have been around for a while, but it's the next natural step. It's just a question of how quickly they get that, how quickly we get to those, and to consumer behavior changing radically based upon the technology available that's in their hands as familiarity grows across those. And obviously for the banks themselves, the question is, how do they react to this? How do they actually take the journey with the customer to make sure that A, they're not losing business, but also that they are offering them those higher levels of service that they're coming to expect from their web-based experiences and their mobile experiences, and also engaging with the customer at a much deeper level. So that's it from me as an introduction. I'm going to hand over, say, to a true domain expert and customer perspective champion. So it's an absolute pleasure to hand over to Phil Winters. Phil, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Ambrose. I hope everybody can hear me. What I'm going to do is first give everyone a little bit of a new orientation before I dive into some examples. I've been very, very lucky in my career to work around the world with many, many, many organizations. And it's interesting, whether you're a commercial organization, a government organization, a nonprofit organization, a church, or whoever you are, I have never met an organization that was not already customer-oriented. Now, this is really important for us here in the banking industry because each one of us, and I've had the pleasure of working already over the years with a number of the people that are online today listening to the webinar, and each one of you has a slightly different way of going about doing things. The most important thing is we are all customer-oriented. We are trying to target individuals, one or more individuals. They could be retail, they could be private, they could be corporate. We're trying to sell them products. We're trying to deliver those products and support those products in a way that every single individual that's interacting with us has a good feeling about it. And to be honest, I've never met any organization that wasn't customer-oriented because if they weren't customer-oriented, they wouldn't be in business. Now, that customer orientation means that there's a lot of things many of us are trying to do. We are all taking a look at technology. We're trying to take a look at new ways of approaching things. We're looking at new channels. We're looking at things such as CRM or marketing automation. We're looking at data warehousing or Customer 360. All of these different things that are happening out there, and many of us are actually going to the point of trying to dive in even more into the data to get a better understanding of the customer so that we can be better customer-oriented. Now, if we agree that we're all to that point and we're all trying to use these technologies and approaches, there's a couple of things, though, that we need to take a look at, and one of those is called the customer journey. So given the fact that we're all customer-oriented, this customer journey is not something that is totally new. Before I dive in there, I'd like to hand back over to Ambrosia and ask my first question. So, Ambrosia, can you ask that question and see if we can get some results?
I can. Thank you, Phil. It's Ambrose here. So what we're going to ask that is your experience to date in terms of the customer journey. So as you can see, there's a multiple choice question there. So if you can, in the next 30, 45 seconds, please read those. I will read those aloud and then consider your answers. First option is we have used customer journey successfully. Second option, we have used customer journey with mixed success. We have heard of customer journey but have not yet applied it. And customer journey as a concept is new to our organization. So please, members of the audience, if you just consider those for a moment and make your choice. Phil, what's behind this question? What motivated this question?
Well, the interesting thing is the concept of customer journey has been around for a very long time, first promoted in the early 90s by Don Peppers and Martha Rogers, who were my former good colleagues. And they brought out some ideas that really helped people start mapping. So for a lot of people, this is old, but there's two or three things that have happened. Some people have tried it. Some people have tried it without success. And for others, it is something totally new. So before I sort of orient around my version of customer journey, it's sort of interesting to see from the audience what they think and where they are right now.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, let's see what the results are showing us. I'm going to move on to that. Okay, interesting. We have 46, almost half, have used customer journey with mixed success. Okay, interesting. 16% use claiming success for customer journey. Heard of, just over a quarter of respondents have yet to apply it, so fertile ground for customer journey. And customer journey as a concept being new, just 11.1%. How does that scan for you, Phil? What in terms of those results? Is that pretty standard, or anything in there that's a surprise?
Absolutely not. The 46% is spot on with everyone else I've done this with around the world. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the next slide and I'm going to tell you why. You see, when the customer journey concept was put together, it all started around our view of the customer. In other words, us reaching out to the customer so that we could target, sell, deliver, and support. But one of the things that I discovered when I started looking at customer journey about 10 years ago was the fact that our selling cycle and the way we look at this out towards our new and existing customers is very different than the customer's buying cycle. What do I mean by that? Well, first off, look at this little graph on the screen and you'll see what I mean. The first thing you'll notice is that I'm not using words to describe the customer's perspective of the buying cycle. I'm not using words like target, sell, deliver, support, because to be honest, no customer would ever use those words. Hi, honey, I've been targeted today by an organization. We would, as people, use different words. We would use words like decide, select, purchase, receive, use. And the most fascinating thing about the buying cycle, or what I call the customer perspective cycle, the decision cycle, is our decisions actually start as individuals far earlier than we as organizations have traditionally started working with individuals. And that's why my version of the customer journey is a little different, because I don't take just the perspective of the organization, I take the perspective of the customer. And that starts with needs, and those needs are very important. So the first thing I'd like you to think of is the fact that we're not going to use the words we would use, but throughout this presentation, you're going to see me use words that the customer would use, such as needs, research, decide. Now, let me just focus in on this one for just a minute, this needs, because that's really important. One of the challenges we have in the banking industry or the financial industry in general is the fact that our products are not a need. You know, I do not need a savings account. I do not need a checking account. My needs are actually much higher level than that. I have some requirements. I need to be able to interact with my payments in a particular way. I want it to be safe. I want it to be efficient. I want it to be easy to use. I want it to be cost effective. But the interesting thing is when you talk to all of the psychologists, they tell you that there are two other components of needs that are incredibly important: social needs and emotional needs. And when somebody starts a decision to make any sort of decision, whether it be for a glass of water versus a glass of cola, or for a type of car, or for a type of television, or even for a type of banking product, they are going to go through with these three things in their head. And the most fascinating thing is it's not just the utility, it's not just the concrete interaction, it's the social and emotional components that help us to make a decision about how we are going to move forward. And that social and emotional component across the board, whether it's very simple interaction, a very complex decision, always is almost 80%. Now, this is not new for the psychiatrists and the psychologists out there. As a matter of fact, the book by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, Thinking Fast and Slow, talks all about how the human brain goes about making decisions. And he emphasizes the fact that this fast decision-making, the social and emotional, are so important. Now, I'm not going to go into that, but when we take a look at the customer journey, we need to be thinking about those needs much earlier than we traditionally do when we start trying to sell a product. We need to be taking a look at that entire cycle. Now, that cycle, I'm just going to go back one because I clicked too quickly. That cycle that we have there, so you could say, okay, well, Phil, does that mean our needs have changed over the last number of years? Or does it mean that the decision cycle we go through for a complex decision, as, for example, changing a bank, getting a new banking product, getting a new financial product, has that changed? Absolutely not. Probably for the last 250 to 300,000 years, there's been no change in the way human beings go through a decision process, especially for a complex decision. What has changed, and this is where the customer journey map comes in, what has changed from the customer perspective is thinking about how do people gather information at each stage to make a decision. If you think of the banking world, we used to just go to the bank and we talk to our banking agent, we talk to our broker, we talk to our financial advisor, or maybe we pick up the phone. And we would do that for every single thing we needed to do, whether it be research or making the decision or purchasing. In today's world, there are literally hundreds of different ways that we can gather information to make and take a decision. Some of us would call that multi-channel or omni-channel. I hate those words because I don't think any consumer out there or individual out there would ever use it. I call them touch points. And it's those touch points that have changed. And so when you take a look at the concept of the customer journey map, if you're doing it from the company perspective, there's things you can miss. But what I'm going to show you is how to use the customer journey map in a very focused, straightforward, structured way to think about the customer's perspective, the customer's decision cycle, and most importantly, the different groups of individuals that are making decisions using those different touch points. And it's those touch points, whether they be digital touch points, mobile, or whatever, that are, of course, drastically changing based on the way that people are interacting with the world. Now, I've been very lucky over the last 18 months. I've been running customer journey workshops around the world, truly around the world. I've done it in 4 different continents. An awful lot of those individuals were business to consumer. Surprisingly enough, a lot of the individuals in the workshop were also business to business. You can see the breakdown of function and all of the different industries where we took this concept of taking the customer journey map from the customer's perspective and applied it. I've put it into a very popular book that's out there in its 2nd edition. It's out there in English and in German. And one of the topics that I talk about there is customer journey mapping. Now, I've been very lucky. There's about 13 different topics that you can see there that I cover. I'm going to focus on 2 of them for the purposes of this webcast, and it's because it has absolutely to do with the banking or the financial services or the fintech industry. So that's enough of a basis. I'd like to dive straight into banking and fintech now. And Ambrose, if you wouldn't mind, let's ask the next question.
Thank you, Phil. So our next poll is around challenges. So what are your top challenges? As you see, there's multiple choice again. So if you just give us your top choice on this poll. So we have customer expectations, increasing competition from fintech, not making enough money, common I think, and regulatory pressure. Again, the choices here, Phil, that you've offered on this multiple choice question. Again, what was the genesis? What was behind them?
Well, what I keep finding is that, first off, I think all of us will be affected by every single one of these. But if you could pick your top 1 or 2 choices, it's always interesting to see across the different countries that I've worked with how they sort of orient to each of these topics. I'll be honest, I'm calling in from Germany, where I live. Yes, I'm an American, but I'm a European. And so in Germany, for example, it comes out very, very much regulatory pressure. In other countries, sometimes you get a little different mix in terms of what people in the particular country think are the most important. And I'm very interested to see what the current results are in the UK. And I'll come back and say exactly why I've asked these questions in just a minute.
It's interesting, that's because in my introduction there, when I talked about customer expectations, but also one of the things was about the competitive environment, because we know it's very difficult to make money in the banking services at the front end for that mass market. So I think that's a really appetite question for the moment. So let's see if we've got the results. Yeah, so we're going to move on and have a look at the polls. Okay. Okay, it's interesting. We have a kind of fairly even split. I think 54% on customer expectations, followed by regulatory pressure, 46%, 30% to nearly a third, increasing competition from fintech, and 16% not making enough money, proving there is some honesty out there, I guess. Perhaps. What do you think about this? What are those polls? What does that say to you, Phil?
What it says to me is that what I like is the fact that in the UK, the number 1 is customer expectations. Of course, regulatory is a real pain, and I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit when I go through some specific banking examples. In some countries, as I said, for example, in Germany, the regulatory pressure seems to have overridden the customer expectations. My main focus would say everybody is absolutely right. We have to take a look at the customer expectations and sort those out, and some of the other things can then fall in line behind. And that's exactly what I'm going to do now, is I'm going to focus on the customer expectations, but I promise you to come back and talk a little bit about how some of these techniques I'm showing you can also help with some of the regulatory pressure. Not to get the laws changed, but at least to try to help follow the existing regulations that are out there. And you can see here, that's exactly the sort of things that I've been talking about. Now, what I'd like to do now is have everybody put their financial services, their banking hats on. You are now a customer. And let's take a look at this decision cycle. I've got a little bit of a decision cycle up there at the top. What you see is that we've got some needs, and those needs aren't necessarily very concrete. You know, they may not be, I need a product called X, but there'll be something out there that we know that we can address. Then from the customer's perspective, they will do a little bit of research. They may do a little bit of comparison before they buy. Then they want to use or take advantage of that product. And of course, the most important thing in many cases is they'll have a memory of that particular decision cycle. If the memory of the whole process is good, it means that that person is more likely to come back to you next time for their next banking product or need that you can fulfill without necessarily doing all the research and comparison. If they have a bad experience through the process, of course, that makes it even harder. Now, what's interesting about this is many of us in banking will say, well, Phil, that's fine, but in many cases, that's sort of the good old days. And in the good old days, it was very, very easy. If people had needs, they basically came to our bank. And they talked to us, and they came and they talked to, I've used the word agent here. You can use the word, whatever your favorite word is internally for the person that has one-to-one contact at the desk. It could be a banking advisor. It could be a family banker. It could be whatever you want to call that. But basically the major touch point people had when they had some sort of a need is that they needed to go through and actually come and talk to somebody about it. Now, on my slide, there's something that's not quite showing up, and there it is. And now we've got it. And in many cases, I think we all know that in the old days, a lot of times people couldn't actually even articulate their needs. So we needed to help them. We needed to awaken those needs, have them come from the subconscious to the conscious and saying, yes, this is important for me, it's important for my family, it's important for my future. But all of that was done in the good old days over the banking person in the branch bank doing this sort of thing. So what has changed from the customer's perspective? Well, what's changed is two things. First off, the customer has become very much in control of that decision cycle. The other thing that's happened is that when we are still using banking people, whether they're our own banking staff or whether they're externals that work with us independently, we're seeing a lot of change, and we can explain that best based on looking at this decision cycle. So at the top, you see a very basic customer journey map, the same one we had before, and down the left you see, let's just say, 3 different groups of individuals. We all know that those groups of individuals will be using all of the available touch points in a different way than they used to use in the past. And that's what's changed. And as a matter of fact, we may even have groups of individuals that don't want to have anything to do with a human being as they walk through the early parts of this cycle. Or maybe they can avoid the human touch point altogether. So what we have to do is we have to go in there and take a look at the different groups. One group that is out there, and each one of you can segment your customers differently. By the way, what data whispering is actually all about customer intelligence. It's just that my mother has never understood the concept of data mining, so I say data whispering because it whispers to me. When we go in and look at our customers, we should be looking at them not only because of their propensity to purchase something or because they might have high value. We need to be looking at them as groups of individuals that have a behavior behavior pattern. In other words, what touch points are they using? Do they wish to use? What touch points can we use to actually awaken that interest? And those may be totally modern touch points. They could be digital touch points. They might be things that are on the mobile device. But this group of individuals will be the new generation who are going through this cycle, and they're looking at different digital touch points, different alternate touch points to try to get the information and to walk through and make a decision. Now, what's interesting about that is it's something that we've all looked at in the past, but there are also other groups, and these other groups may actually want a particular customer. So let's just take a look first at this initial group. So let us say we have a group of individuals, and we're all suffering from this problem. We have groups of individuals that want to use alternate touch points. I'm just going to focus on the step called comparison, but they might want to use it for research or information gathering. They might want to actually use it for purchasing a project, but let's just focus on that step called compare. They may go and do a search. They may go onto an online forum. They may go onto Facebook. They may be using alternate touch points. It's important to very quickly understand what are your target audiences going to be looking at. One of the things that the customer journey map allows us to do is helps target and identify which touch points are important, but most importantly, it helps us to choreograph. The initial touch point that a consumer or an individual uses to start doing a comparison might not be the ideal touch point to help them come to a decision. We need to then start guiding them. So for example, if it's a search, maybe we need to end up on our website. If it is on some sort of interactive forum, if it's Facebook, we need to be thinking of the ways of saying, okay, we have become aware that an individual is starting to compare using this touch point. How can we not only respond to that request, but what is the next logical step? What is the next touch point that we can do? How can we help guide them to the right information? And you can see now how this customer orientation really, really helps us in terms of coming up with priorities. What I am suggesting is that none of us throw away our digital platforms or our digital investment. None of us have to go out and start again from scratch. We have some fantastic assets within our organizations already. As a matter of fact, when I do this with organizations, I do not pull in an external team to help define the decision cycle. I do it with a group of internal people, because in a day or two, and yes, you heard me correctly, in a day or two, you can actually get this high-level view pretty well documented. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand from our customers for each logical step, each where, who is going to start on what touch point, when are they going to use it, and what are the right ways that we can lead them through the path. Now, maybe those paths that we lead them down will have nothing to do with human beings, but what I find is that at some point you always want, even in fintechs, you always want to give some sort of an alternative for even the true digital freaks of getting some help and interacting with a human being when you want it. So that might be through a chat, it might be through a call center, it might be through an offer to call back. There can be lots and lots and lots of different ways of doing this. But you can see how this orientation and this very simple mapping can really help you to realign. Now, when we do that, what we find is that I can do this with organizations on paper very, very, very quickly. One of the questions you may be asking me is, okay, Phil, Sugar CRM is sponsoring your webinar. Why are they doing that? Because at the moment you're talking much, much, much earlier than a CRM system. Well, I think there's two reasons. First off, I do not believe that from the customer perspective, a digital strategy can be separated from the human touchpoint strategy. At some point, there's going to be an overlap and an interaction. And in many cases, the CRM system is the place where you can pull all of that together. But the other reason I'm doing this with Sugar is because they have taken a lot of my concepts here and actually put it into the software. They have visualized the customer journey. And you can see that here on one simple example. They have been collecting the different touch points, whether that comes through something that they capture themselves in the CRM, or whether they've pulled those in from alternate IT systems. They've pulled in channels. They've been able to identify some milestones, some tasks. And when you start walking people through this journey and you see it visually, you can always see where a prospect absolutely is. And by the way, early in this stage, we may not even know who that individual is because they have not yet identified themselves with an email or a name. But we do know that they started walking through the journey. And when something happens that stops them completing going forward, we can go back and ask ourselves concretely, from the customer's perspective, what happened and what can we do internally. So you can see, if you're looking at organizations that are actually heavily dealing with the new digital touch points, trying to figure out how mobile is interacting. The customer journey map, first done on paper, can help you to prioritize some things. By the way, one of the things I find is that if you do a customer journey map from the customer's perspective, there are no longer any department fights because it's no longer a question of who owns the customer. Because quite frankly, from the customer's perspective, there is no such thing as ownership. The customer is dealing with you as an organization, wants to make sure that this entire process is done well. So we've taken just a quick look at the whole topic of digital and that group of individuals who is using the digital channels and how this might help you either on paper or through a CRM system such as Sugar to actually help document and visualize and track this much better. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to spend another 10 minutes on something that I think is even more important than the digital customer experience, and that is around the topic of the agent. Every bank I've worked with has a challenge now today with their internal employees who act as the contact point with the banking customer. Or possibly you have external people, an agent or a broker or a financial or an independent or something. And we all have the problem that these agents are being bombarded even internally within the bank, with lots of things to do every day, and there's just not enough time to do them all. And so, we've been using customer intelligence and data mining to say propensity to purchase, and here's 5 products that this customer could buy, and this is a high-value customer, so try to sell them this, that, and the other. And it's very, very, very difficult, though, in this world. Well, agents also have a decision cycle. And in the old days, the way we used to control our bankers to get them to sell the right thing is we actually paid them more. We paid them a higher commission. And we tried to get them to sell product A rather than product B, or if they're independent, to actually leave. But let's take a look at how the customer perspective and the decision cycle actually affects an agent. Well, here's a little decision cycle for an agent up at the top. And this is what every one of our human beings in our organization does every day. They have needs. They go through and say, okay, what are my options and what are my decision? How am I going to actually execute this, and how do I make sure it worked? And if you look at this, every human being I know that works for a banking organization doesn't just think about commissions. They want to have an easy life. They want to have things that are easy to sell. They want to have work removed from them that they really don't want to do. And a lot of times this is the regulatory things. And I want to show you how this customer journey, customer mapping can actually help you there. Because what they want to do is they want to focus on what they can do best. They can focus on those one-to-one meetings and closing the deal, making sure the customer understands, making sure the customer is aware, and making the right decision. But of course, they have some social and emotional needs as well. They'd like to show everybody they're doing it correctly. They'd like to go home on time. And most importantly, I have never met someone in banking who didn't want to have a happy customer. It's not just about selling the product. It's about making sure that that customer comes back to me and wants to talk to to me. Now, that applies for people who only want to work with agents, but it also applies to those who only occasionally have to interact with us. And you see what I've got here. Only that very first one is a utilitarian need. Everything else is social and emotional. So let me walk through just a fantastic example that I have done for real. I'm going to use an example not out of the UK, because there's so many UK banks on the call today. I'm going to use an example that I did with a bank in Italy that has 5,500 banking financial advisors, and they have no retail outlets. So they have exactly this challenge. So what did we do? Well, we put something together for those individuals that said, hey, we're going to take away and automate for you a lot of the things that you don't like to do. We're going to do a lot of the needs awakening for you. We're going to follow up using our IT infrastructure and our call center. We're going to do a little bit of basic follow-up. We're going to try to schedule that meeting for you, and so that you can get in there and do what you need to do, make sure we've done the protocoling correctly so that from a regulatory standpoint, we're going to make sure afterwards then, and we're going to take over the tasks of doing some of the follow-up and the thank you and things, and also trying to make it very easy for you to go back and say 6 months or 12 months and saying, is everything good, or is there anything else I can do for you? Because we're going to set this up so that we can do with you exactly and focus on what you're good at. Now, how does that work? Now, these screens may be a little hard to see, so remember afterwards you're going to have access to the video, and I'll make sure that you can have access to a PDF of the slides as well so that you can enlarge it. But let's say that I've got an email. I am now a financial advisor, and I've been given an email that says we've identified a particular potential for you. We think this is the one for your customer you should be doing. If I click on yes, I'd like to do that, what starts is a customer journey. I've not only documented it using customer journey mapping, but in this case, I'm again using Sugar CRM to say this whole series of structured steps has started for me. I now, as an individual, know exactly what's going to happen to my customer. I know that there are going to be emails going out. I know that I can, the different steps. I can come back over the next couple of days and I can see for all of my different customers every step of the way, where they are on the journey, what has happened, where they are, and if I need to do something. And most importantly, when I now need to focus on the activities that I want to focus on, which is here, which is running the meeting, I can take over, I can run the meeting, I can type in what I need to type in, I can use my protocols to make sure that from a compliance perspective, everything is done, captured in the system, and then when I've completed, the system automatically takes the next steps of the customer journey over for me. It sends the emails for me. It does some of the follow-up. It highlights for me if there's some sort of a stop in the system. And at any time, I can get back there and control the system. Now, if you can give your family bankers, your agents, your interactive people capabilities like this, all of a sudden they want to use the online system. They want to use the CRM because this is making their life easier. But you can see what I've done here a little bit in these two examples. What I've tried to do is use the concept of the customer journey to not only show you how to change the perspective, but also how to use it to map out and structure some of those interactive things. I've chosen to use Sugar CRM today to show you how to do that. Sugar, in my opinion, has a very, very, very good customer journey object following a lot of my concepts here. What's most important is they already provide some basic examples so that you can get going quickly. What I find is that if you show this sort of thing to anyone involved in managing the customer experience, they love it because those social and emotional needs of their own are now satisfied because they can see every step of the way. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of other examples here, but we've gone through
Phil,
Yes.
it's Ambrose. Can I just interrupt you just very briefly? Say we've got about 5 minutes
Absolutely.
to go. of the main presentation, 5 or 6 minutes to go on that. I just want to remind the audience that please do submit your questions. We're going to go straight into a Q&A at the end of the presentation in the next few minutes. The questions are anonymized. I shall be reading them aloud to Phil for Phil to answer. So please do submit them, safe in the knowledge that you can submit them anonymously, and you won't be either at risk of either enhancing or indeed damaging your career by asking a question of Phil today. So I just wanted to highlight that to the audience. We're going to move on to the Q&A in 5 or 6 minutes' time. Thanks. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah,
Phil.
and thanks, Ambrose. And for me, guys, gals, everybody that's out there listening today, please submit the tough questions. As you can understand, when you're talking about a 45-minute webcast, I am trying to get you as many of the concepts across as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible, but there's always questions. And it's those questions that I live for at the end of the at the end of the session. I've just got 2 or 3 more slides to finish up here to sort of show you how this all comes together, and I am hoping there are some good questions. So, and please don't pull your punches. If you think this is good, ask a good question about how it moves forward. If you think this is total rubbish, I'd like to hear that as well in question form so I can respond to it. I've seen that it's through the Q&A that we can really, really pass on some of the experience I've gathered with all of the organizations. So I'll just wrap up here a little bit now on a couple of slides very quickly. What I've tried to do is change your perspective and not just have you customer-oriented, but have you take the customer perspective. I've tried to show you how to do that by using different words to describe the buying cycle or the decision cycle. I've tried to point out that we now have different groups of people going through the exact same cycle, but using totally different touch points depending upon their orientation. I've shown you an extreme example where we use just digital touch points, and I've shown you an extreme example where we still have the agent responsible for the interaction with the customer. But of course, the reality of this is somewhere in the middle. You will have different organizations that are actually, different groups of individuals that are actually mixing and matching across these 2 extremes. And it's through this customer journey mapping that I hope you can start documenting it. What's fascinating for me is if you take a look at how Sugar does this, they allow you to mix and match all sorts of touchpoint choreographies. These customer journey maps can be mixed and matched. On the screen here, you see a mixture of both digital journeys as well as agent journeys. As a matter of fact, this example is actually a mixture of English and German, so it shows you that it actually goes across borders as well. But at any time in the blue bar, you can see exactly where a customer is, and you can see exactly what the next step should be. And that helps you take the decision, what is it that we need to do to move some of these decision cycles forward? So I hope that through this very simple 2 examples, I've taken the 2 extremes of the customer in control and showed you a little bit about how you can use customer journey mapping and possibly a good CRM solution to help you choreograph and guide. And I've also tried to show you how you can use the same concepts to realign your agents to be doing a little bit more. And it's particularly in this documentation around the compliance aspects where I find that the agents and the bankers really, really, really like doing this, because it means it's much more structured, they can do it much more quickly, and they're not just entering data for the sake of entering data. That's it from my side. Just 1 or 2 of the topics that I could cover in the book. I'm going to leave it on this slide as we take questions and answers. There's a couple of things you can do here if you want to know more. They're on my website. You can sign up for a newsletter. No, you do not get sold to, but in the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a free e-learning workshop that comes online that everyone can take if you want to actually dive in and try to do a little bit of this customer journey mapping. Of course, you can get the book, which I would appreciate, and Sugar CRM has sponsored a bit of a discount code there. And last but not least, if you're interested in seeing a little bit more about how these customer journeys can be put into action, we've got the Sugar CRM web link down there at the bottom. From my side, I think I've said more than enough. I'm really looking forward to the questions. Ambrose, what do we got?
Thank you, Phil. Okay, yeah, we've had quite a few in. I'm going to quickly, because we have a bit of time, we've got about 15 minutes. So before I ask some audience questions, I'm going to ask you a journalist question, if I may. And
Certainly.
That is around. We started off talking about emotional needs, emotional responses. In your experience dealing with both the supply side from the technology and from the CRM side, but also really from the demand side from the banks themselves, how much of a willingness does exist to use data or the journey map that you described to change the emotional expectation of the customer? And I'm thinking about this in the context of, we're talking about agents, we're talking about banks. You know, the three strongest letters that you speak to anybody, the man in the street, and you talk to about bank engagements, and those letters will be PPI, and that's very much a real thing that still carries on. Do you see this methodology and these systems and using the data and the CRM as a way to move on from that emotional expectation of people engaging with their banks and actually change that customer experience?
Yes, because one of the things you'll find is many of us started out with the data, or we start out with the touch, or we start out with the channels. And as a matter of fact, most of the big management consulting companies start off with the channel. But by starting out with the decision cycle, you can take a look and say which touch points are being used for which channel. And that's an incredibly important topic, because then if you can start identifying that, you can start seeing what data do we have that helps identify where the customer is in the journey and how that journey is going. As a matter of fact, this is a loaded question. You did not know this, but in the book there's a whole chapter on using data to measure customer delight. And I use that term concretely because there's some things we can determine from the data, not just on a did the transaction complete, but there are some things we can use on each touch point to actually go through and say, how did the customer feel about that experience? And it doesn't necessarily mean we have to ask them a question. There's a lot we can do from the data. So I agree with you. What the customer perspective does do is it gives you a way of starting to focus, because we should not try to boil the ocean. I believe that no customer 360 product will ever be finished, and you can use customer journey mapping and the customer perspective to help you do some prioritizing to say which holes in our data strategy can we fill first, what can we load up first, what is the next step we want to do. Does that answer the question a little bit?
It does. Thank you. So I'm going to move on now to questions directly from the audience, and the first of which is around fintech. Do you believe fintech is the main reason that clients can choose one bank from another?
No. I believe it has, if you think about how I think of things, the customer perspective means that I don't know any individual out there in the world that has ever, as a consumer, heard of the word fintech. That's a term that we've come up with internally to identify a series of products and services that seem to be meeting a group of customer needs and behavior patterns. I think fintech is getting it a little better in certain cases, but I don't think it's, fintech caused the change. I think the customer behavior change came from a lot of other things. It came with an understanding from a customer perspective. I want to have all these touch points at my fingertips. I do it for my holiday. I do it when I purchase a car. Why can't I do it for a bank? And the fintech are some of the first ones that have identified that. Now, they can package the things very well, but I don't think it's their exclusive providence. I don't think they have forced the change. I think customer expectations have started forcing the change, and they have been possibly in some cases a little faster at responding. That does not mean the traditional banks that were out of business. It just means we have to be a little smarter in how we're going to add our secret sauce into that mix.
Absolutely. In my experience from the banks I speak to as well, that they are very much engaging with the fintech sector in order to adopt these products, solutions to offer.
Absolutely. So the fintech is the result of behavior needs, not the cause. So it's an effect, and some of it has been fantastic. I use a lot of it myself. I love it. But I think that's been done from the customer perspective. One thing I would like to warn fintech, since it sounded like that question may have come from a fintech, customer behavior patterns, the touch points they're using, are changing. Whereas the decision cycle doesn't change, the touch point behavior pattern is changing ever so quickly. And that means all of us, whether we be a bank, whether we be a service provider, we need to be on top of that, possibly using customer journey mapping, to have those early identifiers of which touch points are going to be hot as the initial touch points in the future. Because I don't think this is over by a long shot.
Okay. Next question is, Phil, how important do you think root cause analysis is in terms of customer complaints to use as a basis for reviewing individual customer journeys within banking, for example?
Root cause is very, very, very well established, and I've used root cause quite a bit myself. So if you've got a good root cause practice within your organization, and it's something that is very efficient, it can add a lot of value. What I find, though, is that as soon as you take the customer perspective, sometimes you need to back up a little bit, and root cause analysis is not the first step you would take, but it would be the second, one of the next steps you would take after having redefined the customer perspective. By the way, every organization out there can define the customer journey in less than 2 days at the high level. I have seen this over and over and over. I've done this literally hundreds and hundreds of times. And the reason is you get your experts from within your banking organization together because they can actually describe this customer journey. They've just never been asked. So root cause analysis is a fantastic tool, but for me it's a second step down from first taking the customer perspective and getting some of that new orientation.
Good, thank you. And now again, it's probably as expected. It's really about the increasing competition from fintech. How do you think is that impacting customer expectations? Is that what is driving these changes within the bank? Is it coming from fintech, or are there other? I think
fintech is the result of trying to respond to customer expectations. But the interesting thing is that maybe there's a huge group of banking products and services that can be handled well by fintech, but at some point there's still going to be that human interaction. And maybe for another series of products, the whole fintech approach is not going to be appropriate. So for any banking organization, I think it's a matter of understanding who is the target audience you're trying to go for. Is it differentiated? What do you consider to be your special secret sauce? I remember all the years, over the years, as different banks in the UK have come together and tried to merge. I won't name any names, but we had the red and the blues coming together, and in some cases the red and blues are now going out apart again from each other. And, but each organization had a little different way of approaching the market, a little different way of looking at it. The products are pretty much the same in many cases. So it's really a question of how can we awaken that interest in helping manage the behavior? How can we identify that early? What can we offer them that's a little different, that they actually appreciate, that makes it a little bit more of an emotional experience? And to be honest, I can have an emotional experience with a fintech as well. It's absolutely not an issue, but we need to be thinking that way because every one of us will want to approach it a little differently. What's interesting here over in Germany is that we've seen Aldi in the telecommunications industry pretty much wipe out the traditional way that the telcos go about trying to get new business because customer expectations of the touch points they want to use have changed. So over in the UK, the fintechs are kind of driving that, but I don't think we're going to be finished there. Fintechs may be able to provide some of that much faster, but I think we all need to be well aware. What is it that makes our organization a little different? How do we integrate that? At the end of the day, there was a huge survey done of 1,500 organizations. This was B2B, but I think it applies to individuals as well, where early in the cycle, people want to use the digital touch points as efficiently as possible. But at some point, they want the option of talking to an individual. And that option to talk to an individual, in 66% of the case, is still what helps them to make the decision for the product or service. And when we think of fintech, I think one of my problems is there seems to be digital or traditional. And I think it's the mixture of the two that's really going to be successful.
Okay, Phil, last question, I think, or maybe a last one questions. Could this approach, the journey, customer journey and journey mapping approach, be used with external agents such as intermediary staff?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's within the new version of the book. I have a whole chapter focusing on agents. You can see the example I've done here in the middle. One of the things when you've got external agents is they've got too many different external things pushing at them, and it can't just be the amount of money that they make. So if you offer more money, then your competition might offer more money, and you get this back and forth. It's true not only in retail, across the board, in many, many, many things. So what you do is you actually offer them an infrastructure that helps them do their jobs better. Similar to what I showed you here today, you can offer this sort of service that I was showing you in Sugar CRM to external agents and say, hey, if you go with us and the recommendation we're doing for you, not only are you going to be paid fairly, but we're going to make your life a lot easier. And oh, by the way, all of that regulatory reporting you've got to do as you go through this journey, we're going to try to make that as efficient and painless as possible so that you know exactly where you are. And so this whole concept applied to external agents, I think, is even more powerful than when we apply it to the internal agents.
Okay. Do you think customers are becoming cynical of customer satisfaction, and how can you measure satisfaction?
I think customers are becoming, getting a little fed up with NPS. I mean, when, that question that you pop up, were you satisfied and would you recommend this to your friends? If I'm on a website for the very first time and I've found something that interests me on your website and I did it through a search and I just happened to end up on you, I don't necessarily yet know who you are. Maybe you've provided me some information that's really helpful and I'd like to continue my conversation with you, but there's no way that I can yet say, would you recommend us to your friends? The answer is no, I have no bloody clue who you are. But when you take the customer perspective and you understand what touch points are available where, and you take the data that's available underneath the covers, you can actually go through and start checking 5 different concrete steps. Did we complete the transaction? Did we complete it efficiently? Was there any sort of personalization available? Were we able to help the person to the next step? Could we actually, at some point, make this a unique experience that they're going to remember? And I think a lot of the things about customer satisfaction, we need to be doing more behind the scenes. Now, of course, as soon as customers know us, it's a fantastic way of getting feedback. But for all of those things that are really early in the decision cycle, remember those first 3 or 4 steps in the buying cycle, they may not know who we are. I think there's some alternate ways that you can do that, and the customer journey, the customer perspective, and how you go about using data can help there. My trick in all of these, because I know we're going to run out of time, whatever you do, focus. Don't try to do the whole thing. There's some fantastic examples of how you can pick up some very small pieces of this and quickly start experimenting to see how you can focus in on a portion of the journey, use your existing IT infrastructure to help you move forward. And particularly if you've got something like Sugar, you can turn this sort of thing on very, very quickly. That would be my recommendation. Focus in tightly on a business issue and start focus so you can get some results quickly.
Fantastic. Excuse me. Fantastic. Thank you, Phil. The results-driven IT investment. Hopefully, it's definitely something for the that's going to increasingly be adopted. But we could probably talk for another hour about that. So listen, it just remains me to say thank you very much indeed to Phil Winters for a fantastic presentation. Thank you to Sugar CRM for sponsoring this session. Most of all, thank you to our audience for giving up their time, for taking the time and effort to join us today. Thank you for answering the polls and for your fantastic questions. To the attendees, you will receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar, and you can access it, or you can access it through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please keep an eye out on the website just mentioned. Follow us on Twitter at BRWebinars for daily updates, or join our LinkedIn group at Business Review Webinars. In closing, as I say, it just remains me to say thank you again to Phil. Thank you again to Sugar CRM. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to providing another in-depth webinar from Business Review very soon. Thank you and goodbye.